Oh hey, how's it going? I hope you're all doing well. It's been a long time, a little over 3 weeks in fact, since we last talked about Lethal Company. I mean, it might as well be years at this point, and man, a lot has changed. We got a new version, Update 64, which brought with it a new utility item, the Belt Bag, and a rare new weather event called the Meteor Shower, which is, of course, utterly terrifying. But more terrifying than that is the news that with this latest update, it seems that Zeekers is going to be taking a break from creating content for this game for a little while, in hopes of finishing off one of their other projects. So chances are that this might be the last Lethal Company update that we see before the end of this year at least. I know, devastating news, but while that might be disappointing in some regards, I don't think it's necessarily all bad. For one thing, we're going to have a new game from Zeekers out sometime relatively soon, so that'll be fun. But also, as somebody who makes content about Lethal Company, I can't say that I'm too displeased with the idea of being able to take things slow for a while, and using this time to establish a good sense of where the game is at with respect to its lore. There's still a lot of unknowns here, and this potential off time is the perfect excuse to get our bearings and re-examine some of the mysteries that haven't been solved within this game. The last video that I put out on this channel was focused around one such mystery, more precisely the question of what is actually going on within Lethal Company's 2 opening cinematics. And the discussion around that topic in the comments section was so good that I decided why not extend the conversation to the rest of the game's unknowns, since it seems like we might be stuck with them for a little while. So even though we only recently wrapped up another similar discussion on this channel, it seems that now is coincidentally the perfect time to dust off the old detective hat and get right back into the thick of it. Today we'll be taking a look back at some of Lethal Company's major unsolved mysteries, from launch to the present day, exploring a couple of theories for where all this could be going, and even delving into some thoughts that you guys have left me along the way. This is a comprehensive look into the major mysteries of Lethal Company's world. Before we get started though, videos like this one require a lot of research, which often means I find myself on all manner of websites. But the fact of the matter is that simply by visiting some of these sites, my data is probably being used in ways I wouldn't necessarily approve of, which is why I've begun using today's sponsor, Surfshark, to help me secure myself on and offline. Surfshark is a downloadable cybersecurity suite that protects your data and sanity with their powerful ad blocker, antivirus, and of course, a feature-rich VPN that masks your IP address while you browse the web. With over 3,000 servers worldwide, Surfshark also allows you to bypass regional content restrictions. For example, I recently got caught up with the Chainsaw Man manga and found myself wanting to rewatch the anime, which isn't available on Netflix in my region. With Surfshark though, I can simply flip my virtual location to Tokyo, and there you have it. They also have a no-logs policy, meaning that not even Surfshark themselves is able to snoop on your data. So with all this in mind, it's no wonder why the service is literally award-winning. So, if you want to try it out for yourself, well, now's your chance. You can get set up with a 1 or 2 year plan using my link in the description, or use code EVERVPN at checkout to get 4 additional months for free, all at no risk thanks to Surfshark's 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you again to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video. I hope that you guys will decide to go check them out, and with that, let's dive back in to our first mystery. To the surprise of probably no one, we're beginning things off with what is undoubtedly the game's most enduring mystery. It's been the driving question of the entire lore of this title since its very first version, and in spite of a good amount of hinting on the part of the game's creator, it's not something we're bound to have a solid answer to until pretty much the end of the game's update cycle. And that is the question of just what is going on inside the company building, located on 71 Gordian. Everyone watching probably has asked this question at some point in time. And similarly, I'm sure that we're all familiar with our one means of interacting with whoever or whatever is inside directly. Visiting the small redemption window on Gordian is essential to fulfilling your quota, and therefore, it's often seen as a rather mundane activity. But nevertheless, there are 2 distinct things that can happen which pretty clearly indicate to us that whatever is inside the company building, it's not human. The first is the most mundane. If you follow the instructions outlined in the operations manual found on the ship, then after the window opens, a giant hook-like appendage will draw the scrap you've collected inside. But if you're more reckless, ringing the bell and making a lot of noise directly in front of the open window, you might just be grabbed by this thing. A long, dark red tentacle-like appendage with bristling hairs or spines along its length. These are the only two physical indications of the form of the creature that haunts the interior of this concrete structure. But even so, these brief glimpses, paired with the ominous sounds we can hear emanating from the window and building itself, have inspired a large number of fan theories. One theory is that whatever awaits inside is an entity of the Lovecraftian variety, a creature that may hold vast destructive power, the likes of which would be nigh impossible to attain by other lesser beings. But that's certainly not the only interpretation, and I myself have recently joked about it being something much less interesting. It's also worth noting, as I did in my Lethal Company timeline video, that the way this creature is framed in some of the game's other material, particularly Sigurd's logs, make it out to seem like the monster inside of the company may actually be the company itself, which can be a little bit weird to rationalize. My personal thought is that by likening the company to a horror on this scale, Zeekers might, in a small way, be presenting a commentary about the nature of big business. Think about it. Business is something that needs to be constantly fed in order to be placated. The ramification of its simply being can indeed be harrowing, and of course, an unchecked business can definitely pose an existential threat to a greater population. While it's an interesting lens to view the monster through, though, I would highly doubt that its only purpose in the story is to serve as a plot device in the form of this metaphor. So, for the time being, we're still waiting to get a better idea of what this threat might be, where it came from, and whether or not our actions in-game will be able to spell an end to it for good. In a way, though, this is sort of just one aspect of the mystery that is the company as a whole. Sigurd's logs bring up a lot of adjacent questions, such as who it is that the company phone actually directs to. But by far the biggest mystery that ties into all of this has been, quite literally, right under our nose since the very beginning. When visiting Gordion, if you head over to the left-hand side of the ship and navigate around some of the cargo containers arranged on the platform, you can find a trapdoor that allows access to a catwalk extending below the ship's landing area. Following this catwalk to the end, you'll find one of Sigurd's logs. But it was discovered early into Lethal Company's life that there is another secret area hidden down here that's a little bit more difficult to access. Here's how it works. Once you get to the bottom of this ladder, you have to jump the catwalk guardrail and platform along the scaffolding that holds up the landing area above us. On screen now, you're seeing the route that I choose to take, but there are several other potential routes too. No matter how you decide to navigate forward though, you'll eventually end up on a small platform cloistered away from the surface, where there are a few objects of interest. I would recommend investigating the light switch first, which hangs from the ceiling, and which if pressed, illuminates the other big object, a massive piece of machinery inscribed with the words "Don't Tell" in bold red lettering. Now, let's get one thing out of the way right off the bat. This is a drill. Even today, nearly a full year since this game came out, I still see people debating this. And while usually most of you will know I'm pretty open to interpretation, I've got it on pretty good authority that we have this one nailed down. And that good authority is none other than Zeekers himself, who alluded to it on Patreon almost exactly a year ago from the day this video is being posted. In a post made on September 26th, 2023, entitled "The Beta Test Plus Bug Fixing," Zeekers includes a piece of concept art that references this object for what it is. And while I won't be showing that art on screen out of respect to Zeekers and his work, you should just check out his Patreon for yourself if you want to see it, I'll go ahead and describe it for you. The image shows the drill in two distinct states. On the right is a plain version that looks just about identical to what we see in-game, and on the left is a repaired version of sorts, which shows 7 different things which we as players seemingly need to supply in order to make it operational. First is a lever that would be inserted here, a repair to this wire, some kind of light or aperture that would be placed here, a drill bit on the front, 2 canisters of some kind, likely apparatuses, placed here, and a battery of some sort that plugs into the back. The big kicker, though, is the title of this particular scrap of art, placed elegantly at the top of the page, which simply reads Desmond's Drill, which... tells us quite a lot. The question of what happened to Sigurd's crew following their final log, also entitled Desmond, which dates back to October 15th, 1968, is another matter that has long been a subject of interest for players. But it seems that Zeekers has some kind of plan for the fate of Sigurd, Desmond, and the other members of the crew of 1968, as well as the exact nature and motives of the company, and that all of these things are, in the future, likely going to be answered pretty much at once. Perhaps even some point relatively soon. Zeekers has been open on Patreon about the idea that this drill and its completion is intimately tied to the end of Lethal Company's story. In his most recent post at the time of recording, he's also expressed that the ending of the game is something he feels very passionate about, and portraying it in a way that does justice to the rest of the game while staying true to the story he wants to tell is a task that he's putting a lot of thought into. So I think it stands to reason that this thing does still have some relevance. We just have to wait and see how all of it manifests in game. But I'm betting that sooner rather than later, we're actually going to get a resolution here. This could also be a hint that we're getting closer to Lethal Company being effectively a complete product. But there's still a lot more that we'd like to have the answers to before then, not the least of which is... I talked to a voice on the walkie-talkie. It was like a part of the screams. He told me the Golden Planet actually existed. It's not a legend. And he told me it didn't just hit a meteor. He said the planet was swallowed up by the beast, and they were in its body being digested. I asked what the beast is, and he said he didn't know. He said it ate the planet, and they forgot everything. I couldn't get him to stop talking, but I said he was on the other side of a big wall, and I could get him out. I said he was inside the building, and that's when he started freaking out. I couldn't make out a word. I think he said something about spitting out the rinds, so I just turned it off. What a whack. Jess says the Golden Planet is just a story. I said, I know, I'm not an idiot. Well, she said I should quit, and she quits if I do, so she's staying. Out of all the mysterious logs left behind by Sigurd, chances are this log, Golden Planet, is the most bizarre, with the strangeness around it beginning before you even open up the log to read in the first place, since it's the only record of its kind that doesn't include the exact date of its creation. For those of us that have been involved with this game for a while, you may also remember that this log garnered something of a reputation in the early days for being one of several that was initially really difficult to find, despite the fact that it was lying pretty much directly next to Rend's fire exit the entire time. Needless to say, this strange reputation precedes it, and as you can probably tell based off of the reading, the content itself is no less bizarre. According to what we can glean from Sigurd's writing, the Golden Planet seems to be a well-known folktale within the world of Lethal Company, in which the titular world was apparently struck by a meteor, leading to its annihilation. However, as the voice behind the wall says, the story seems to have some basis in reality. The only difference is that instead of being struck by a space rock, the planet was apparently eaten by whatever lurks inside the company walls. This allegation, of course, causes us to ask a whole slew of questions. If the planet was eaten, then how did the person who speaks to Sigurd survive? And what kind of monster are we dealing with that has the capability to consume an entire planet? In my previous video, many of you put forward the idea that the Golden Planet may be linked in some way with the cinematic segments introduced in version 50 and 60, and there may be some credence to this idea, but we'll talk about that in a bit more depth later on. For now though, let's move on to something a little bit different. Delving deep within one of Lethal Company's facilities is nearly always a nerve-wracking experience on some level. Part of what makes this game so enjoyable is the way that it demands you to always be on edge, be mindful of your surroundings, both in a visual sense, but also by keeping an ear open. Many of these games' monsters are often heard before they're seen, but among the other dreaded sounds that players would likely rather not come across in the depths of a facility, the Jester's slow rendition of Pop Goes the Weasel is certainly an off-putting and distressing one. Unlike many other monsters, the Jester is incapable of killing players right away. In its normal form, it's actually quite passive. It will follow the player around without posing too much of a problem, but it's when the Jester begins whining that things can get really bad, really fast. From the time the song starts, you and anyone else inside this facility, whether they've been close enough to hear the song or not, has 40 seconds to evacuate the area, or they'll have the misfortune of facing an unkillable and omnipotent predator once the Jester pops. As long as there's anyone inside the facility at this point, the Jester will always be able to hunt them down regardless of distance with ruthless efficiency. And while a knowing team often has the skill set and good sense to avoid this scenario altogether, the fact remains that, at least on paper, this is one of Lethal Company's most ruthless hunters, and it's led many to ask one simple question. What actually is this, and where did it come from? The Jester was this game's first black box enemy, a creature for which there's no valuable information to be gleaned from the bestiary, but it certainly wouldn't be the last, and it seems like there's a new, similarly unexplained monster added on a decently frequent basis at this point. In my Lethal Company timeline video, I speculated that a lot of these enemies, including the Jester, as well as other unexplained abnormalities such as the Masked and the Nutcrackers, may have a connection of some kind due to them sharing a similar whimsical theme. Each of these enemies is inherently based off of the idea of a toy or novelty item of some kind, and this is a sentiment that might extend to one of the game's more recent additions as well, the Barber, who also has virtually nothing known about them except for this weird poem where a proper bestiary entry should be. I had a dream about the barber. One day he made me a wig because his scissors were too big. Of course, any potential connection between these misfit toys remains purely hypothetical, but aside from these four, there's also the matter of the ghost girl to rationalize. On the surface, she actually seems to make more sense than the previously mentioned monsters, but she's also one of just two enemies in the game, along with the Masked, that is completely unscannable, so clues to her origins are even more sparse. Who was this child? How did she die? And why was such a young girl even present on these inhospitable moons in the first place? Perhaps we'll never know, or perhaps she really is meant as nothing more than a reference to similar icons of the horror genre in other media. But there's one more enemy that's just as mysterious and strange, but which paradoxically has more lore pertaining to it than almost any other creature in the game, and that is the Old Birds. When these massive autonomous constructs were first introduced back in version 50, they had the single longest bestiary entry in the entire game at the time. But despite having a wealth of knowledge regarding their abilities, their tendencies, and even their cultural impact on the world of Lethal Company over time, the origins of the Old Birds have only become more mysterious, not less, since their introduction. When version 50 was still in its beta phase back in April, the Old Birds bestiary entry was actually even longer, but upon its official release, the majority of one of the passages was removed, with that passage reading as follows. The subject of who developed the Old Birds has been an intense debate since their first recorded appearance on December 18th of 2143, when over 50 Old Birds invaded the Anglian capital. This is considered one of the first major causes for the downfall of the Anglian Empire. The most commonly upheld theory takes into account the tension between the Anglian and Beaumont military throughout the 2100s. However, nothing has been proven in the centuries since. If we're to check out the Old Bird entry in the game today, we'll see that the beginning of this passage remains intact, but it just sort of ends mid-sentence, as if removed by mistake. It's really bizarre. This renders all mentions of the Anglian or Beaumont as effectively non-canon, and because of that, any inkling that we may have had as to the Old Bird's origin has been wiped from the record. I made a whole video about this a few months back, and I think it still actually holds up pretty well, and goes over pretty much everything that we know about the Old Birds, but one persistent theory in regards to them seems to be that they might have a connection to a particularly ancient war. A war which just so happens to be our next topic of interest. The second to last of Sigurd's logs chronologically, entitled Real Job, is a very unique piece of text. It's the only journal entry added to the game post-launch, being introduced in version 47, and it's also one of the most revealing when it comes to Lethal Company's more hyper-diegetic elements. This log brings several mysteries to light, including a small passage which recontextualizes the passing of Richard, whose death was first confirmed in the log Goodbye, but perhaps more interestingly, it also clues us into a stellar conflict taking place at roughly the same time that it was written. I miss Dad. I hope he isn't staying on Titan. People are saying it's not going to look the same in 2 years. Jess told us they're about to go to war, and everyone is waiting for it. Ever since this line was first included, the war on Titan has been a talking point for much of the Lethal Company community. It's unclear what the conflict on the moon would have been fought over, who it was fought against, and why, but the description of the moon itself may offer some insight into at least one of these areas. History. It looks like this moon was mined for resources. It's easy to get lost within the giant industrial complex. There are many entrances to it littered about the landscape. Fauna. Dangerous entities have been rumored to take up residence in the vast network of tunnels. We know, based on this text, that before it was abandoned, Titan's composition made it an optimal moon for mining, meaning that even though the mine shaft is not the most common interior to spawn here, I think it's actually canonically what most of the inside of this moon looks like, which is sort of interesting. And judging by the vast structure we see when landing here, it's rather likely that whatever was being extracted would have been exceptionally important and/or temperamental enough to constitute a great level of industrialization and attention paid to its acquisition. It's very likely that a war of any kind concerning this moon would have been driven, at least in part, by the potential to acquire such resources and infrastructure for oneself. I've even gone so far as to posit the theory that old birds may have been involved, with the Anglian Empire and the Bumok military potentially being the two involved parties here, though even if we ignore the issues concerning their canonicity that I mentioned before, there's also the matter of the old birds not having been observed publicly until the 2100s. Seeing that this war probably would have taken place in or before 1970. What seems more plausible is that this war may have seen the use of coil heads, which are thought to have been first created as bioweapons according to their bestiary entry. Still though, the plausibility of this remains unclear. Luckily, we do have some insight into at least one conflict that does, for sure, involve the use of coil heads that may or may not be related to this, and that brings us to the final mystery that I want to talk about today. So, I know I just made an entire video about these, but looking into the rest of the subjects today, as well as some of the comments from you guys on the last one, it's made me keen to revisit them and discuss some additional factors or alternative interpretations that I hadn't brought up before. And let's face it, a video about the mysteries of Lethal Company wouldn't exactly be complete without some mention of what I myself have dubbed the game's biggest and strangest unanswered question. Released alongside version 50 and version 60, these two opening cinematics offer a unique look into the world of the game outside of the bounds of what we're normally permitted to see. In one, we bear witness to some kind of massacre, as coil heads ravage an unknown facility, and in the other, we adopt the viewpoint of somebody, likely a fired company employee, as they drift through the black emptiness of space. In both cutscenes, though, a mysterious doorway seems to open out of nowhere, bathing our protagonist in a yellow-gold light before the scenes abruptly end. And that's pretty much it. Except there are also a handful of hidden texts which seem to offer more insight into the hidden plot of these short clips. Now, I'm not going to retread every observation or theory that I posed in my last video, but the main premise is that the way I see it, the secret messages hidden within each scene seem to allude to these doors appearing before company workers in order to supply them with some kind of salvation. What exactly that salvation is, I left kind of open-ended, because it's really anyone's best guess at this point, but there were two prevailing theories that were brought up several times each within the comments of the previous video that I think are well worth taking a closer look at. First was the presumption that these inexplicable doorways were simply representative of a sort of afterlife. In other words, the salvation that seemed to be promised here wasn't necessarily a place, but rather a state of being, the only thing irrefutable and irreversible enough to ensure someone's freedom from the grasp of the company: death. This is something that admittedly I never really considered seriously when doing my research and writing the script for that last video. And the reason is because while this may be a sound way to interpret the subtextual or implied meaning of these scenes, it doesn't really tell us much about the literal goings-on right before our eyes. My thought process here is comparable to what I said about the company monster earlier in this video. Although the monster could serve as a metaphor for capitalistic greed and the evils of big business, within the realm of the Lethal Company story, that monster is still seen as its own tangible threat, regardless of how poetic its existence may seem to the player. It may also be worth considering how these scenes read if the afterlife theory is taken to be true. The cutscene from version 50 could still have some narrative value, considering the highlight of the cinematic isn't so much to do with the main character themselves, as much as it is all of the other things going on around them, namely the attack on the facility, but the second cinematic, if we reduce the significance of the door to merely being a plot device for the afterlife, is very little more than a minute and a half of some guy dying of oxygen deprivation out in space. So while these doors bring to mind the idea of going into the light and force us to grapple with some interesting insights in that regard, I would argue that while they probably do evoke that imagery by design, I don't know if that rationalization suffices in justifying us waving them off as nothing more than a cool metaphor. That's purely my own interpretation though, and truthfully, I agree with the conclusions this theory draws regarding the subtext of the scenes. I think the parallels here are intentional, but I also think we might be missing something here. The other theory though is one we've already touched on briefly. What if these doorways have something to do with the Golden Planet? And while I like the idea here, especially because of how it attempts to incorporate another long-standing mystery, there admittedly isn't a ton of evidence to support this idea. I mean, the doors do emit a goldish light, but that's kind of circumstantial evidence at best. Still, it feels like we might be onto something here, and so I want to posit the idea that maybe both of these interpretations, the afterlife theory and the Golden Planet one, aren't as disparate as they may at first seem. Even within the Golden Planet log by Sigurd, the very little that we know of this location makes it out to seem like an idealistic place. Its very name implies wealth or purity of some kind, and if and when we actually get to see the place, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that the Golden Planet, at least so far, does sort of sound like a reasonable in-universe vehicle for those themes of heaven or the afterlife that others have suggested. We also know that the Golden Planet was probably swallowed by the company monster, and I'll admit that if there are wormholes opening to bring company employees there for whatever reason, that's something that we're going to need more than a little bit of additional context to really understand. But I guess, overall, it really does seem like the Golden Planet, thematically paired with the concept of a utopia or a second lease on life, so perfectly opposes the darker themes of the company and its monster that it's hard for me to not at least place some amount of stock in this. But make no mistake, this is, once again, just my own ramblings, and as I said in my last video, pretty much any interpretation of these doors is fair game until Zeekers proves otherwise. There's also one more thing with regards to that version 50 cutscene in particular that I wanted to bring up briefly that's similarly inspired by comments I got in my last video, because in that upload, I operated under the assumption that the facility that we see may have been manufacturing coil heads, based again off of their bestiary page. But some of you guys brought up the point that, on the contrary, the scene actually can be read as having much the opposite connotation. What if this wasn't a matter of an SCP-style breach of containment, but rather a deliberate, coordinated attack by a third party? This could potentially explain away some of the oddities of this scene, like the flashlight pointed toward the door, sort of insinuating that our protagonist has had to assume a defensive position from this room. And it also helps to explain why this space is more so reminiscent of someone's office as opposed to some sort of crazy undercover observation or weapons testing area. Many stated that they believe this scene portrays some of the initial events during the War on Titan, and others even suggest that the protagonist of the scene might actually be Sigurd's dad, seeing as he's known to have stayed on Titan in some capacity shortly before the presumed outbreak of the conflict, and because of the secret text seen on both the black screen near the cutscene's end and an extended version which is viewable on the computer terminal, which both mention that the narrator is not staying somewhere. I would not be the first to suggest the parallels between this text and what Sigurd says of his dad in the real job log. It almost reads as a direct response to his son's musings. It's all very interesting to consider, and I think that this theory holds more water than the one I first posed regarding the nature of this facility. What's funny is that when the version 50 cutscene first came out, I remember theorizing about it with some friends, and we all came up with something along similar lines, but it took me making an entire video about it in order to really see the light again, and it's only because of you guys posing your thoughts in the comments that I'm able to say with confidence that I believe you guys really hit the nail on the head with this one. So, in the vast sea of mysteries that we have from this game, which all seem to be stuck in deadlock, thanks to everyone who helped to further our understanding about at least one of them, I would bet that some other solutions are lying similarly just out of reach. Either way, though, that pretty much wraps up this brief overview of Lethal Company's major mysteries, or at least all of the ones that came to mind for me. If there's any unanswered questions that you want to know the answers to that I may or may not have covered, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm sure that there's stuff that I've yet to consider. Some honorable mentions that almost made it into this video include the State of 44 liquidation, which is an unused moon in the game's code, and the mystery surrounding the death of Richard, more specifically how he's mentioned in the real job log. But I didn't have a ton to say about either of these points, so hey, if you have any thoughts about either of them, I'd love to hear it. Regardless, I hope that some people found this video to be a worthwhile reference point in the story of Lethal Company so far. I also want to give another brief thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video. Use code EverVPN or my link in the description to get started with a 1 or 2 year plan and grab 4 additional months of protection for free. I think that just about does it for me though. Thank you to everyone who made it all the way to the end, and I look forward to seeing you again with some new content. This is Everberon. I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.